The door clicked shut at 11:47 p.m. Millie knew the time because she looked at her phone when she heard it. Not because she was waiting, she told herself, but because she wanted to know. She wanted to have the exact time recorded somewhere, the way you record the time of a death. She had walked back to Nancy and David's apartment on autopilot. Her feet had made the decision before her brain had finished processing what her eyes had just seen, which was perhaps for the best, because if her brain had been fully in charge, she might have sat down on the estate pavement and not gotten up for several hours. She let herself in with her key. She sat on the couch in the dark. She did not turn the lights on. She sat there with her hands folded over her pregnant belly, and she waited. And the waiting was the worst part because it gave her mind time to replay. The door opening, the towel, the color leaving his face, and then the bedroom, and then Nancy, and then the specific way Nancy's face had moved through its expressions, like a woman frantically searching her pockets for something she already knew wasn't there. My best friend, Millie thought. She said it again, silently, the way you press a bruise to confirm it is still there. My best friend. The key turned in the lock at 11:53 p.m. Nancy came in quietly, the way you come into an apartment when you think no one is awake, and she made it 3 steps inside before she registered the shape on the couch and stopped. For a moment, neither of them moved. The apartment was dark, except for the light bleeding in from the estate outside, falling in strips through the curtain across the floor between them. Millie, Nancy started. Turn the light on, Millie said. Her voice was very calm. This was more frightening than shouting would have been. Nancy turned the light on. They looked at each other in the full brightness of it. No shadows, nothing softened, everything exactly as it was. Nancy still in her mini dress, heels in her hand, bold makeup that had survived the evening, looking almost accusatorily intact. Millie in her satin robe, long black hair loose, gold earrings still in, hands folded over the evidence of a future that had just become significantly more complicated. Sit down, Millie said. Millie, I need you to let me explain. Nancy, a pause. Sit down. Nancy sat. The silence that followed lasted approximately 15 seconds, which is a very long time when 2 people are sitting in a lit room and one of them has just found the other in a bed that was not hers. Then Millie laughed. It was not a happy laugh. It was the laugh of a woman who had found something so absurd at the bottom of her pain that her body didn't know what else to do with it. How long? Millie said. Not a question, a starting point. Nancy looked at her hands. Millie, I am asking you a direct question and I need a direct answer and I need it right now, Nancy Adeyemi. How long? Nancy looked up. Before you, he and I we were together before you met him, before you even knew he existed. Something moved across Millie's face. Before I met him. Yes. So, when I came home that night from Temi's party and I told you about this man I had just met and I showed you his picture. The silence answered for Nancy. Millie stood up. It was not a dramatic stand. She didn't flip anything or raise her voice, not yet. She just stood up the way a woman stands up when she needs to be on her feet for what comes next. One hand on the armrest because she was 7 months pregnant and some things required assistance regardless of how angry you were. You knew, Millie said. You sat there and you looked at that picture and you knew. And you said, he is hot. I am happy for you. Millie, he is hot, she repeated it. I am happy for you. She looked at Nancy with an expression that had moved past anger into something more structural, the kind of feeling that doesn't shout because it doesn't need to. Those were the words you chose. I didn't know how to tell you. That night, Nancy, and now the volume arrived, sudden and enormous, filling the apartment like a pressure change. You could have told me that night. You could have said, Millie, I know this man. Millie, this is complicated. Millie, please sit down because I have something to tell you. She broke off, pressing her lips together, collecting herself. Instead, you said he was hot. I know. And then I spent 3 months. Millie's voice cracked just slightly, just at the edge of the word, and she pushed through it. 3 months talking to you about him. Every detail. You were the person I told everything to. You were... She stopped. Nancy, you were the first person I called when I found out I was pregnant. The room went very quiet. Nancy's eyes were wet. She didn't try to hide it. "I know," she whispered. "Before John, before my mother, before anyone, I called you first because you are my best friend. And that is what best friends are for. And the whole time," she gestured, a wide, helpless gesture that encompassed everything. The apartment outside, the estate of the last year of their lives. "The whole time you were..." She couldn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. "Why didn't you stop?" Millie asked. She had sat back down. Not because the anger had passed, but because she was 7 months pregnant and her feet hurt and even devastation had to make practical concessions. "I want the real answer, Nancy. Not the one that makes you look better. The real one." Nancy was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Millie almost repeated the question. "Because I couldn't," Nancy said finally. "And I know how that sounds. I know it sounds like an excuse, and I know it doesn't fix anything, but that's the real answer. I couldn't stop, and I kept telling myself I would, and then," she exhaled. "He texted and I would go." Millie looked at her. "Did you love him?" The question landed in the room and sat there. "I don't know," Nancy said. I think I loved what it was, the first version of it, before everything got complicated. Before I existed in the picture. Yes." Millie nodded slowly, the nod of a woman filing information rather than accepting it. "And David," Nancy flinched. "David is..." She stopped. "David is a good man. David genuinely is a good man, and he deserved none of this." "Neither did I," Millie said quietly. "No," Nancy said. "You didn't. You really didn't." They sat in the particular silence of two women who have known each other long enough that even their silences have texture. This one felt like a room after furniture has been removed. Same walls, same floors, same light, but hollowed. Next door, separated by one shared wall and approximately 4 inches of plaster, something else entirely was happening. David had not gone home after the hospital. He had stood in the corridor of that apartment building for approximately 90 seconds after Millie walked out and stared at the closed door. Then he knocked again, not the careful knock of before, the knock of a man who was done being careful. "John?" John opened it, still in the tower. David looked at him. John looked at David. From the outside, and thankfully no one in the corridor to observe this, the sight of these two men facing each other was deeply, cosmically strange. Same height, same bone structure, same jaw that set in the same direction when they were thinking, same hands, David's currently at his sides, John's holding the door, wide-palmed, long-fingered, their mother's hands on two bodies that had spent 31 years making different choices with them. "Let me in," David said. "John?" "David," his voice was very quiet. "Let me in." John stepped back. David walked into the apartment and stood in the living room and looked around it slowly, the evidence of an arrangement that had been running parallel to his own life for God knows how long. Then he turned and looked at his brother. How long? John had the decency not to pretend he didn't understand the question. "It started before you, before any of this. Me and Nancy, we had a thing before Millie. Yes." David laughed. It was the same laugh Millie laughed 20 minutes ago on the other side of the wall, the one that lives at the bottom of something too large to process any other way. "You're telling me," he said slowly, "you were with Nancy. Then you started dating her best friend. Then I started dating Nancy." He paused. "And nobody said anything?" "It's more complicated than..." "Is it?" David tilted his head. The gesture was so familiar that John felt it like a mirror being held up. "Because from where I'm standing, it sounds very simple. You chose Millie because Nancy told you about her, didn't you?" John said nothing, which was its own answer. David nodded. He sat down on the edge of the couch, not because he was comfortable, but because his legs made an executive decision. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped, and he looked at his brother with the expression of a man who has known someone their entire life and is meeting them for the first time. "She's pregnant," David said. Not Nancy. The way he said it made it clear which pregnancy he meant. His voice shifted slightly, the anger under it giving way briefly to something more complicated and more tired. John looked at his hands. "I know." "And Nancy?" "I know," John said again. David looked up slowly. The look on his face when the full mathematics of it arrived was something John would not easily forget. Not anger now, just the quiet devastation of a man doing arithmetic he didn't ask to do. John, he said, tell me something honestly. Okay, are both of those babies yours? The generator hummed. The question sat in the room like a third person. John did not answer immediately, and his not answering immediately was itself the most comprehensive answer he could have given. David stood up. He picked up his keys from the table, his keys which he had set down on his twin brother's table in an apartment he now understood had been the site of a parallel life running alongside his own, and he walked to the door. David, John started. Don't, David said, the same word Nancy had said in the car all those months ago. He opened the door. I need you to not talk to me right now. The door closed. Not slammed, closed, which was somehow worse. Back in Nancy and David's apartment, the argument had moved into its third and quietest phase, the one that comes after the volume and after the questions, when two people are simply sitting with the full weight of what has been said. Millie was looking at the floor. Nancy was looking at Millie. I'm sorry, Nancy said. She had said it twice already. She said it again, not because she thought repetition would fix anything, but because it was the only true thing she had left to offer, and she needed Millie to know she meant it. I'm genuinely, completely sorry. Not for getting caught, for doing it, for all of it. Millie looked up. Her eyes were dry now. She had cycled through the tears earlier and come out the other side into something cleaner and colder. You know what the worst part is? Tell me. I'm not even surprised that he did it, she said it slowly, like she was discovering it as she spoke. John, I think some part of me always knew there was something about him that wasn't fully present, something he was always half keeping. She looked at Nancy. But you, Nancy, you are the person I call when things go wrong. You are the person I would have called tonight if... She stopped, laughed again, that hollow laugh. Do you understand how insane that is? My first instinct when I found out, even tonight, even after everything, my first instinct was to call you. Nancy pressed her mouth over her. 6 years, Millie said. I have known you for 6 years and I have trusted you with everything, and you sat across from me every single day and you... She pressed her lips together. How did you do it? How did you sit there and listen to me talk about him and just... It was the hardest thing I've ever done, Nancy said. I know that doesn't matter, but it was. You're right, Millie said. It doesn't matter. The silence came back. And then Millie made a sound. Not a word, not a cry. Something in between, sharp and involuntary. Her hand going immediately to her stomach and her face contracting. Nancy was off the couch before the sound had finished. Millie. I'm fine, Millie started, and then her face did something that overruled the sentence completely, and she gripped the armrest with one hand and Nancy's arm with the other, and said in a voice that was suddenly very different from any voice she had used tonight, Nancy. I've got you, Nancy said immediately. I've got you, okay? I've got you. She grabbed her phone, she grabbed Millie's bag. She got Millie to her feet with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had grown up watching her mother handle emergencies in a household that produced them regularly. Millie gripped her arm and breathed and said nothing for a moment, and then said, with the specific dark comedy of a woman who had clearly not lost her personality even in crisis, I cannot believe this baby is choosing tonight. Your child, Nancy said, getting her toward the door, has her mother's sense of timing. Huh? I'm guessing. You'd better be right, Millie said, and then gripped her arm harder as another contraction arrived, and Nancy held on and didn't let go. She called John from the car, then David, then Millie's mother. By the time they reached the hospital, all three of them were on their way, which meant that in approximately 20 minutes, all four of them, Nancy, John, David, and Millie, would be in the same building again, in the same waiting room, under lights that, unlike the estate and the apartment and the Lagos night, had absolutely no interest in being flattering to anyone. The Lagos University Teaching Hospital at 1 a.m. was its own particular universe. It operated on a logic that had nothing to do with the one outside its doors. Time moved differently here, Sound moved differently. The fluorescent lights overhead existed in a frequency that made everyone look equally terrible, regardless of their baseline, which was perhaps the only genuinely democratic thing about the place. The waiting room outside the maternity ward was a long rectangular space with plastic chairs bolted to the wall in rows, a vending machine that accepted money and provided nothing in return, a television mounted in a corner playing a gospel channel that nobody had asked for, and a general atmosphere of suspended time that made an hour feel like 4. Nancy had been sitting in it for 23 minutes when John arrived. She heard him before she saw him, the particular rhythm of his footsteps in the corridor, which she knew and hated herself for knowing. And she looked up and watched him come through the double doors in the same sharp suit from earlier, tie loosened now, the self-possession that was usually his default setting visibly absent. He saw her. She looked away first. He sat down. Not beside her, across the room, 3 rows of bolted plastic chairs between them, which in a waiting room of this size was both a significant distance and not nearly enough of one. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and looked at the floor. They did not speak. The gospel channel offered a woman singing about redemption with considerable vocal commitment. Neither of them found this comforting. David arrived 11 minutes later. He came through the double doors with his jacket gone, shirt sleeves rolled up, the careful composure of a man who had decided on a presentation and was maintaining it through sheer professional discipline. He scanned the waiting room, registered John on one side and Nancy on the other, and selected a chair that was equidistant between them with the precision of a man who had done special mathematics in the corridor before entering. He sat down. He looked at the gospel channel. He looked at his hands. Nobody said anything. The 3 of them sat in the waiting room in a triangle of mutual devastation, each at their own vertex, and the only sound was the gospel singer who had moved on to a second song about grace, which was also not landing the way she intended. A nurse walked through, looked at all of them, looked again, moved on quickly with the expression of a woman who had learned not to ask questions in maternity waiting rooms at 1 a.m. It was John who spoke first, which surprised nobody because John had never been built for silence. "How was she when you brought her in?" he asked. He addressed the question to the middle distance between himself and Nancy, technically directed at her without being directed at her. "Contractions were 4 minutes apart by the time we arrived," Nancy said, to the same middle distance. "They took her in immediately." "She's early," John said. 7 months, Nancy said. "The doctor said it's manageable. She's going to be fine." A pause. "The baby, also fine, most likely," Nancy said, finally looking at him directly for the first time since the waiting room. "She's going to be fine, John?" He nodded, looked at his hands. David, across the room, said nothing. He was looking at the television with a focused attention of a man who was not watching it at all. 20 minutes passed. The vending machine hummed. The gospel channel cycled to a 3rd song. A couple came in through the double doors, young, terrified, holding hands, and sat in the corner and spoke to each other in whispers. Normal people, having a normal emergency, completely unaware they had wandered into the specific epicenter of someone else's considerably more complicated one. It was David who broke his silence, and when he did it without preamble, without looking away from the television, in a voice that was very quiet and very even. "I need to know," he said, "whose babies they are." The young couple in the corner did not hear this. The gospel singer continued undisturbed. Nancy went very still. John looked at his brother across the rows of plastic chairs. "John," John started. "I have been sitting here," David said in the same quiet voice, "for 20 minutes. I have not said anything because there is a woman I care about in that room, and that takes priority over everything else right now." He paused. "But I am going to need an answer to this question before I leave this building tonight, so I am asking it now while we are all here, while there is nowhere to go." He looked at John, then at Nancy, then at John again. Whose babies are they? The waiting room held its breath. John rubbed his jaw. That gesture, the one that David also made, their mother's gesture, the one that Nancy had once noted as the only tell either of them had. He rubbed his jaw and he looked at his brother and he said, because there was simply nothing left to hide behind, "I don't know." David closed his eyes. "You don't know?" he repeated. "The timing," John started. "Don't," Nancy said sharply. John stopped. "Don't do the timeline out loud in this waiting room," Nancy said, her voice low and controlled and final.
"Then when?" David asked. He opened his eyes. They were very clear, which was somehow more unsettling than if they had been red. "Because I would like to know, Nancy, at what point it becomes appropriate for me to find out whether the child you are carrying is mine or my brother's. If you could just pencil that into the schedule, I would appreciate it." The sarcasm was so uncharacteristic of David that it landed like a slap. Nancy absorbed it without flinching. "After Willie delivers safely," she said, "then we can talk about everything." "Fine," David said. He looked back at the television. "Fine." Another 30 minutes. The young couple in the corner had been called through and had left with relief visible in every part of their bodies. An older woman came in and sat knitting something yellow, completely at peace with herself. A person from a different and better reality who had accidentally wandered into this one. John stood up at some point and went to get water from a nurse's station down the corridor, and for approximately 4 minutes, it was just Nancy and David in the waiting room, and David looked at her properly for the first time since he had walked through the double doors. She looked back. The fluorescent lights were unkind to both of them. His face was tired in a way that went deeper than the hour. Hers was still. The bold makeup of the evening now simply a record of how the night had started versus how it was going. "Did you love him?" David asked. The same question Millie had asked Nancy an hour ago in their apartment. This version of it was quieter, almost gentle, which made it harder. Nancy thought about lying, considered it seriously, decided she was finished with that particular tool. "I don't think so," she said. "Not the way I should have, for it to justify, not the way that justifies any of it." "But you kept going back." "Yes. Why?" She looked at him, at this man who had held doors open and reorganized her kitchen, and looked at her across dinner tables with the specific attention of someone who was interested in her particularly. At this man who had run from next door when he thought something was wrong and laughed with relief when it was just a pregnancy announcement. At this good, uncomplicated, undeserving man sitting under fluorescent lights in a maternity waiting room at 2 a.m. because of choices she had made. "I don't have an answer that's good enough," she said. "I've looked for one. I don't have it." David nodded slowly. "Okay," he said. "Okay? I'm not saying okay as in it's okay," he said carefully. "I'm saying okay as in I heard you, and I'm going to need a very long time to figure out what to do with it." Nancy nodded. "Are you keeping the baby?" he asked. "Yes," she said immediately. Regardless of everything, yes." He nodded again, looked at his hands. "I'm going to need a paternity test." "I know. And depending on the result." "I know," she said again quietly. "I know, David." John came back with 3 bottles of water and set one carefully in front of each of them and sat back down, and nobody thanked him and nobody expected to. At 3:17 a.m., a nurse came through the double doors. All 3 of them stood up simultaneously, which would have been almost comedic under different circumstances. "Family of Millicent Okafor?" the nurse asked, looking at the 3 people who had stood up with the expression of a woman who was going to let this one go without comment. "Yes," all of them said, together, in unison. The nurse looked at them for a moment. "She's delivered. Mother and baby are both doing well." A pause. "It's a girl." John sat back down. He put his face in his hands. His shoulders moved once and then he was very still. And nobody in the waiting room said anything because some moments don't require commentary. Nancy sat back down beside him, not close, but beside him, and David sat back on his side of the room, and the gospel channel, which had been cycling through its playlist all night, landed on a song about joy. Millie's mother arrived at 3:45 a.m. She was a tall woman, elegantly built, with Millie's cheekbones and none of Millie's patience for nonsense. She swept into the waiting room in a wrapper that she had clearly tied in a hurry and took in the three people sitting in it: her daughter's best friend, her daughter's boyfriend, and a man with the same face as her daughter's boyfriend sitting across the room, and said nothing for a full 5 seconds. Then she said in Igbo something that Nancy's rudimentary grasp of the language could not fully translate, but whose meaning was communicated effectively by the tone alone. Then she said in English, "Which of you is going to explain to me what is happening here and why my daughter is in that room without her mother?" "Mama Millie," Nancy started. "Not you," she said without looking at Nancy. She looked at John. "You." John opened his mouth. "And it better," she said, "be the truth." What followed was not so much a conversation as a one-woman judicial proceeding conducted in a maternity ward waiting room at 4 a.m. with John as the sole defendant and Mama Millie as judge, jury, and sentencing authority. Nancy sat to the side as a witness whose testimony had not yet been requested, but whose time was clearly coming. David sat across the room and watched his brother navigate this, and felt for the first time all night something that was almost, not quite, but almost like sympathy. Almost. By the time it was over, John had told her most of it. Not all, enough. Mama Millie sat with it for a long moment. Then she looked at Nancy. "You," she said, "were going to let my daughter fall in love with this man and say nothing?" She stopped. There was no version of yes that was going to help her here. "Yes," she said. Mama Millie looked at her for a long time with the particular expression of a Nigerian mother who is doing the internal calculation between what she wants to say and what she has decided in this specific location on this specific night. What she settled on was, "My daughter loves you very much." Nancy's jaw tightened. "I know. That is the only reason I am sitting in this chair instead of doing something else." She folded her hands in her lap. "We will talk, all of us, but not tonight." She stood, smoothed her wrapper, and walked through the double doors to her daughter. The waiting room was very quiet. "I like her," David said from across the room. Nobody disagreed. They let John in to see Millie and the baby at 5 a.m. Nancy did not go in. She sat in the plastic chair and she waited, and at some point David moved across the room and sat 2 chairs away from her instead of 3 rows, which was not forgiveness but was something, and she accepted it as what it was. At 5:23 a.m., John came back out. He sat down. He had the look of a man who had just held something that rearranged his priorities completely and was still processing the rearrangement. "She let you hold her?" Nancy asked quietly. "For a minute," he said. A pause. "Millie?" "Didn't look at me." He said it without self-pity, which was the most honest she had ever heard him. "She looked at the baby the whole time I was in there, didn't say a word." Nancy nodded. "She's beautiful, the baby," he said. He looked at his hands, his mother's hands, his brother's hands. "She has Millie's nose already. How does a person have a nose after 5 hours?" "They just do," Nancy said. They sat with that for a moment. "I need a paternity test," he said quietly, not to Nancy specifically, to the room. "I know," Nancy said. "Both of them," he said. "I know, John." David said nothing, but he didn't leave. Nancy was allowed in to see Millie at 6 a.m. just as the Lagos dawn was beginning to suggest itself through the waiting room's single high window, that particular early light that arrives before the heat, gentle and non-committal, the city clearing its throat. She stood in the doorway of the room. Millie was in the bed, hair loose, no gold accessories, no airliner, no bodycon dress, stripped of every signature thing down to just herself, which turned out to be more than enough. The baby was in the cot beside her, wrapped, sleeping with the absolute conviction of someone who had no idea what they had been born into. Nancy looked at Millie in the doorway. Nancy looked at Millie in the bed. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "She's beautiful," Nancy said finally. Millie looked at her daughter. Something moved across her face, complicated and layered, and underneath it all, unmistakably, love. "Yeah, she is." "What's her name?" A pause. "I haven't decided," Millie said. We had a name, John and I." She stopped. "I need a new one." Nancy nodded. She stayed in the doorway. She did not presume to come further. "You can sit down," Millie said, not warmly, not coldly. Factually, "You can sit down," a statement of permission rather than an invitation, with all the difference that implied. Nancy sat down. They sat in the room together as the Lagos dawn came properly through the window, and the baby slept between them, and outside in the waiting room, 2 brothers sat 3 chairs apart under fluorescent lights, and nobody had any answers yet, and the city woke up around all of them, indifferent and enormous and ongoing.
The thing about aftermath is that it doesn't look the way you expect it to. You expect rubble. You expect the visible evidence of collapse, cracked walls, displaced furniture, the kind of obvious destruction that at least has the decency to match how things feel on the inside. What you get instead, mostly, is Tuesday. You get a morning that arrives exactly as it always has, unremarkable and continuous, and you get yourself inside it, changed in ways that don't show from the outside, making coffee and checking your phone and going about the business of a life that has been fundamentally altered, but still stubbornly insists on continuing. 6 months later, Lagos did not care. She had moved. Not far, a different estate, 15 minutes away. Close enough to her mother that help was accessible, and far enough that her mother could not arrive unannounced in under 7 minutes, which Millie had calculated carefully and considered a reasonable buffer. The new apartment was smaller than the old one, brighter, with windows that caught the morning light in a way she hadn't planned for and had come to depend on. Her daughter's name was Amara. She had decided on the third day, sitting in the hospital room with the Lagos dawn coming through the window the same way it had on the night she was born, looking at this small person who had arrived ahead of schedule into a situation that was not ready for her and had absolutely no complaints about any of it. Amara. Grace. It had seemed, under the circumstances, like the right thing to reach for. Amara was 6 months old now and had, as John had observed in the first 5 hours of her life, her mother's nose, her mother's stubbornness, and an opinion about everything that she communicated in a frequency slightly above comfortable. She was, Millie thought on most mornings, while getting her ready, the most demanding and most wonderful thing that had ever happened to her. And the fact that her father was who he was had nothing to do with either of those things. John saw Amara on scheduled days, Wednesday afternoons and every other Sunday. He arrived on time, which was the least he could do and which Millie had made clear was the absolute minimum expectation. He did not come inside. Millie handed Amara to him at the door and closed it and spent the hours he was gone doing things that were specifically for herself: a bath, a book, a phone call with a friend, once a full uninterrupted nap that she still thought about with reverence. She did not speak to him beyond logistics. She has a doctor's appointment Friday. She's been fussy with the left ear. Watch for that. She needs her 6 p.m. feed by 6:15 or she becomes a whole situation. He received all of this information with the attentiveness of a man who understood he was operating on the thinnest possible grace and intended to stay within its boundaries. Millie had not forgiven him. She was not sure forgiveness was the destination. She was not sure it needed to be. What she was building instead was something quieter and more durable, a life that was genuinely hers with Amara at the center of it and everything else arranged around that fact. She had gone back to work 8 weeks after delivery, which her mother called irresponsible and her therapist had called healthy and Millie had called necessary, because sitting in the apartment thinking about things was not going to pay for the new pram she had bought, which cost more than her first month's rent out of university and which she had zero regrets about. She had also, and this was the thing she had not told anyone yet, not even her mother, certainly not Nancy, started talking to someone. Not a man. Not yet, not in the way that implied anything, just a person, a colleague of a friend, met at a small dinner, who had made her laugh 3 times in 20 minutes and then asked, with the straightforward confidence of a man who knew what he wanted to ask, if she would like to have coffee sometime. She had said she would think about it. She was thinking about it. She had been thinking about it for 2 weeks, which her therapist noted in their last session with a carefully neutral expression, quite a lot of thinking for a cup of coffee. It is a symbolic cup of coffee, Millie had said. What does it symbolize? Her therapist had asked. Millie had looked at the ceiling for a moment. That I am still a person, she had said finally. That I am not just somebody's story, that I get to have just something that is mine and new and untouched by any of this. Her therapist had written something down. Does that sound crazy? Millie had asked. It sounds, her therapist had said, like someone who is healing. Millie had driven home and texted him, yes, I would like to have that coffee. He had replied in 4 minutes. She had smiled at her phone, involuntarily, privately, the kind of smile that arises before you've decided to let it, and then looked up and found Amara watching her from the bouncer with an expression of extreme suspicion. Mind your business, Millie told her daughter. Amara blinked. You are 4 months old, Millie said. You don't get opinions yet. Amara made a sound that was, somehow, an opinion. John lived alone. This was not new information to anyone, including John, but it had taken on a texture over the past 6 months that simple aloneness doesn't usually have. The specific quality of a space that was built for more than one person and now held only one, with all the evidence of the life he had been building still present and rearranged by absence. He had kept the apartment on the estate. This had been, on reflection, not his best decision. It sat between the 2 buildings where David and Nancy had lived, a geography that now functioned mostly as a daily reminder of everything he had managed to destroy inside a 200-meter radius. But moving felt like fleeing, and John, whatever else he was not a man who fled. He went to work, he came home, he cooked. He had always been a decent cook, a fact that had once charmed 2 women simultaneously and now charmed nobody, which was probably appropriate. He called his mother on Sundays, the calls shorter than they used to, because his mother was a perceptive woman who could hear things in silences, and he did not currently have the capacity for her perceptions. Amara had changed something in him that he couldn't fully articulate. He had held her for the first time in that hospital room, Millie's eyes fixed on the wall, the silence between them the kind that doesn't invite conversation, and the baby had looked at him with the unfocused absolute attention of a newborn, not knowing who he was, not knowing what he'd done, offering her gaze with a completeness that he had not earned and could not explain, and something in his chest had performed a structural renovation that he had not approved and could not undo. He was trying to be present for Wednesdays and every other Sunday. He knew this was the minimum. He was trying to figure out how to make it more without overstepping into a territory Millie had marked clearly and justifiably as hers. David had moved into a new apartment in Lekki. He had done it the way he did most things, efficiently, without drama, with a thoroughness that meant that by the time he was in the new place, the old one had been completely cleared and returned to the landlord with 3 days' notice and a handshake. He was very good at executing decisions once he made them. The difficulty was always in the making. He had taken 2 weeks off work, which for David Okonkwo was the equivalent of anyone else taking a year. His colleagues had been so alarmed that 3 of them had independently checked if he was dying. He was not dying. He was sitting in a half-furnished apartment eating food his mother had sent and watching documentaries about things that had nothing to do with his life and trying to locate himself inside the wreckage of a situation he had walked into without knowing it was one. He had not spoken to John for 6 weeks. When he finally called, it was on a Sunday, early, before either of them had fully woken into the day, and the conversation was short and careful. 2 men speaking across a distance that was more than the weeks of silence. "Are you okay?" David had asked. "No," John had said. "Are you?" "No," David had said. A pause. "She's beautiful," John had said. "Amara." "I know. I saw the picture Mama sent." Another pause, longer. "David." "Not yet," David had said. "I'm not there yet." "Okay. But I'm working toward it." "Okay," John said again. And then, quieter, "Me too." They had hung up, and David had sat with his coffee going cold and thought about the specific cruelty of loving someone who has done something you cannot immediately forgive. The way the love doesn't switch off cleanly. The way it sits in the chest next to the hurt and refuses to vacate. The 2 of them cohabiting in a way that is deeply inconvenient and apparently non-negotiable. He was working toward it. The paternity results had arrived on a Tuesday. Nancy had called him, not texted, called. which he had looked at his ringing phone and understood was her acknowledging that this particular information could not be delivered in a text without being a different kind of cruelty. He had let it ring twice, then answered. "The results came," she said. "I know, I got the notification." A pause. "David, I know what they say, Nancy." Silence. "She's yours," Nancy quietly. "Our daughter is yours." David had closed his eyes. He had known it was possible, had known it for 6 months, had sat with both possibilities in the way you sit with a medical result you are waiting for, preparing yourself for outcomes you can't yet see. But knowing it was possible and hearing it confirmed were two separate things, and the gap between them, it turned out, was significant. "Okay," he said. "Okay," Nancy asked carefully. "I don't know what else to say right now," he said honestly. I need a minute. Take whatever you need." He had taken 3 days. On the 4th day, he drove to Nancy's apartment. She had moved to, closer to the island, a place he had never been, and knocked on her door. And when she opened it, he looked at her and at the visible evidence of the pregnancy, and he said, "I want to be there. Whatever that looks like, I want to be there when she arrives." Nancy looked at him for a long moment. "You don't have to," she started. "I know I don't have to," he said. "I'm choosing to." She nodded. He nodded back. He had not come inside. They were not together. That was not what this was. What it was two people trying to build something functional out of the wreckage of something that had been built wrong for the sake of a person who had not yet arrived and had no say in any of it. It was slow. It was uncomfortable. It was the most honest thing either of them had done in a long time. Nancy's daughter arrived on a Thursday, 7 days after her due date, which Nancy's mother said meant she was stubborn, which Nancy accepted as fair. She was small and loud and had, from the first hour, an expression of extreme assessment, looking at everything placed in front of her with a careful evaluation of someone who had standards and intended to maintain them. Nancy looked at her in those first minutes and thought, "You deserved better than the circumstances you were conceived in. And then, I am going to spend a long time making sure that doesn't matter." She named her Zara. David had been there, in the waiting room, then in the room, in the chair in the corner, present and quiet and careful, the way he was about most things. When the nurse put Zara in his arms for the first time, he had looked down at her with an expression that Nancy had watched and not interrupted, because some moments belonged only to the people inside them. He came on Tuesdays and Saturdays. He was reliable in the way she was now learning to appreciate reliability, not as a given, but a choice made repeatedly, which was its own kind of love, even if it wasn't the romantic one. They were figuring out what they were to each other. It didn't have a name yet. Nancy had decided names could wait. She had been in therapy since the hospital. Her therapist was a woman who had the particular skill of asking questions that Nancy thought she knew the answers to until she opened her mouth and discovered she didn't. 6 months in, she was finding that the most useful thing therapy had given her was not answers, but a better quality of question, the kind she now asked herself before acting, the small pause between impulse and decision that she had not previously known was available to her. She had not spoken to Millie since the hospital. Not a message, not a call. She had sent flowers when Amara was born, a large arrangement delivered to the maternity ward with a card that said only, "She is here and she is perfect and so are you." She did not know if Millie had kept them. She did not ask. She had been waiting. For what? She couldn't have said exactly. For the right moment, maybe. For herself to be different enough from the woman in that bed to deserve a conversation. For some internal signal that she was ready. Not to be forgiven, she had stopped expecting that as a given, but to ask for the chance to be heard. 6 months, 2 weeks, and 4 days after Millie's door had kicked closed in that apartment, a Saturday morning Nancy woke up and knew. Not because anything had changed, not because a sign had arrived, or a voice had spoken, or a therapy session had produced a revelation, just because she woke up and the knowing was there, quiet and clear and patient, having apparently waited for her to be ready to find it. She got up. She fed her Zara. She got dressed. Not the mini dress, not the bold heels, just herself, plain and present and unglamorous. She kissed her daughter's forehead and she drove 15 minutes across Lagos in the early morning before the heat had fully committed to the day. She parked outside a building she had never been. She sat in the car for a moment. Then she got out, walked to the door and knocked. She heard movement inside. A baby sound quickly settled. Footsteps. The door opened. Millie stood there in her satin robe, Amara on her hip, hair loose, gold hoops in. Of course the gold hoops, some things were load-bearing. And she looked at Nancy on her doorstep, the way you look at something you have been expecting and dreading and perhaps in the quietest cut of yourself, waiting for. Nancy looked at her best friend, at the baby on her hip who had her nose and would apparently have her opinions, at the door held open with one hand, the other supporting Amara, the specific posture of a woman who has not yet decided what she's doing but has not closed the door either. "Hi," Nancy said. Millie looked at her for a long moment. Several things moved across her face, things that had been building for 6 months and had not resolved into a single clean feeling because clean feelings were not available for this and probably would not be for some time. Then Amara grabbed a fistful of Millie's hair with the cheerful aggression of a 6-month-old who had no interest in dramatic pauses, and Millie winced and detached the small hand and looked at her daughter and then back at Nancy, and something in her face shifted. Not resolved, not forgiving, but shifted, like a door, open wider. "She's been up since 5. I have not had coffee yet. There is not enough of it in this apartment for what you are bringing to my doorstep." Nancy exhaled. "I can go get some." Millie looked at her, at Zara, a question in her eyes. Nancy nodded. "She's here. She exists. I'll tell you everything." Millie absorbed this and looked back at Nancy's face and was quiet for another moment. Then she stepped back from the door. Not warmly, not with the old ease, not yet, maybe not for a long time, but back, away from it, leaving it open. "Get the good kind," Nancy said, "from the place on the corner, not the one that's closer. The closer one is terrible and you know it." "I know it," Nancy said. "And get something for the baby," Millie said, "for Amara. She's been smiling at everything this morning. She'll perform for a stranger." "She's not a stranger," Nancy said quietly. Millie looked at her. "She's not a stranger," Nancy said again. "She's yours. That means she's mine too, if you'll let her be." The morning sat between them, warm and patient, the Lagos day beginning its slow build outside, the city clearing its throat the way it always did, indifferent to small miracles as much as large disasters. Millie looked at her daughter, at the woman in her doorway. "Go get the coffee, Nancy," she said. Nancy went. She came back in 11 minutes with 2 large cups from the right place and a small thing of mashed banana for Amara that the woman at the counter had recommended and that Amara received as though it was her sovereign right. She sat across from Millie at the kitchen table, not on the counter, not the bathroom floor, at the table properly, with coffee between them and a baby in a bouncer beside them and 6 months and everything that had happened inside them sitting in the room like furniture that had not yet been arranged. They didn't start with the hard things. They started with Amara, who was indeed performing, big eyes tracking between the 2 women with the focused delight of a baby encountering a new face, breaking into a gummy smile at Nancy that made something in Nancy's chest do something significant. "She smiled at you," Millie said, and her voice was complicated with it. The particular complexity of a woman who loves 2 people who have hurt each other and is watching one of them hold the consequence of all of it. "Her timing," Nancy said. "She smiled right when I needed her to." Millie looked at her daughter for a moment. "Yeah, she does," she said. They drank their coffee. Outside, Lagos continued. The generator, the Okada, the distant music, the city's constant self-narration rolling forward over everything, making no distinction between the ordinary Tuesday and the extraordinary one. Millie said, "I'm not okay yet," not looking up from her cup. "I know. I'm not going to pretend this is fixed. I'm not asking you to. It's going to take..." Millie stopped. "I don't know how long it's going to take. I don't know what it looks like on the other side or if there even is one. I know. I'm here for right now, For this, she gestured between them, at the table and the coffee and the baby, just this, for as long as you let me. Millie looked at her finally, fully, the way she had looked at her across an apartment 6 months ago. No shadows, nothing softened, but different now. The anger still present, but no longer the loudest thing. Underneath it and next to it, and older than both of them, 6 years of something that was real, that had always been real, that the last year had not managed to unmake entirely. "You're going to have to earn it," Millie said. "I know," Nancy said. "All of it, every bit from the beginning. I know. And there are going to be days," Millie said, "where I am not okay and I'm going to need to say that, and you are going to have to sit in it with me. I'll sit in it for as long as you need." Millie looked at her for another moment. Then she looked at Amara, who had fallen asleep in the bouncer with the sudden completeness of a baby who had decided the morning was over, matched banana evidence still on her chin. "She's going to need a friend," Millie said quietly, "when they are older. A girl who will have her back." Nancy looked at Zara's picture on her phone screen. "Mine too." The morning was warm, the coffee was good. Outside, the day was building into the full weight of a Lagos morning, hot and loud and ongoing. Millie reached across the table. Not a hug, not yet, not today, just her hand placed flat on the table halfway between them, an offering, an open question. Nancy looked at it. Then she placed her own hand beside it. Not on top, beside. "Here," her hand said. "I'm here." The two of them sat like that for a moment. Not healed, not restored, not the easy, uncomplicated thing they had been before any of this, but present, choosing to be present, in the same kitchen, in the same morning light, with coffee from the right place, and 2 small babies sleeping in their respective places, and the long, uncertain, and necessary work of rebuilding something that had been broken by someone who loved them both imperfectly. It was not enough. It was a start. And in Lagos, on a Saturday morning, with the city already at full volume and 2 babies sleeping through it, a start was everything.